Episode 189, IRONMAN 70.3 Waco with Scott Lewis. Welcome to the pursuit of the perfect race. I'm Coach Terry Wilson, and with each episode, I bring stories of athletes to you that share their experiences at races in order for you to learn how to have your perfect race. We will hear stories from athletes of all ages, abilities, and races of all distances. So regardless of where you fit in, there's something in there for you. Thanks for spending some time with me today. Now let the pursuit begin. Welcome back to the pursuit of the perfect race. Today I have the pleasure of talking with Scott Lewis about his recent race at Waco 70.3. This race took place on October 28th, 2018, and the swim was canceled. The temperature on race day was 54 and rose to 85, and he had a time of 7 hours, 19 minutes, and 35 seconds. He has a great amount of information to share, and I look forward to diving in and talking about your race, Scott. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Awesome. So what made you want to do this race, man?
It was a Christmas present from my wife, so I owe her for that in many ways. But I'd actually been training for a couple of years, more for the Olympic distance, sprint distance, participated in, maybe a dozen of those, and was training for the Austin 70.3 when it still existed, and ended up injuring myself and had to get out of the sport for about a year and a half. To recover and go through surgery and things like that.
Wow. So what injury did you get and how did you come back from that?
I had a disc that herniated and fragmented. And after it fragmented, the fragment itself actually fell into the spinal column. So it was pushing on the nerve roots that deal with the nerves on the right side of my body. So basically, I had very little strength on the right side from the waist down. Ended up working with a really brilliant a neurosurgeon, and once we finally got all the specialists to do what they're supposed to do, got the right imaging in place, he said, you need to be in surgery as quickly as possible if you want to have feeling in your feet again. And I said, well, let's go do that then. So went in and they performed a laminectomy, went in through the bone, pulled the fragment out. And, 4 months later, I was doing an indoor try with up at Lifetime in Kansas City. Not much of a race to write home about, but emotionally, it was a big deal.
Wow. Because that just established, hey, you're on the way back to where you want to be.
That's right. It was a long road back. I've been able to work with a lot of really great physical therapists, a couple of chiropractors, a gentleman by the name of Jim Heatherman up in Kansas City, who put me back together for years as I, got back onto the road to doing what I like to do.
Wow.
In the sport.
So how did you even know that you had nerve damage? How did all that start?
It was obvious. I was actually on a treadmill, and it was a aggressive run. My right foot came down, and I felt the pop, and there was no doubt about it that something bad had happened. So I was still able to walk under my own power at that point. I left the gym. A couple of days later, I rolled out of bed, fell because I had no control over my right leg, and managed to crawl into the bathroom to try and figure out what the heck was going on. And the nerves in my leg were firing like I was being electrocuted. I've never felt pain like that in my life, but every muscle was out of control, just rapid fire pulsations, things like that. And it was obvious that something was wrong. So this was several years ago now, 4 years ago now, and it was kind of back before some of the hysteria about how we treat chronic pain, which, by the way, I do agree with, but that's a story for another day. Unfortunately, it also meant that if you go to the emergency room, basically all they do is pump you full of drugs and then start handing you off to different specialists. So went from specialist to specialist. I went through shots with pain management clinic, multiple months of physical therapy. And, eventually I saw a neurosurgeon at my own direction and he said, well, we need to get some films on this. Went to a radiology clinic, got the MRI done, physically took the films back to this doctor, and 3 weeks later, I was under the knife.
Wow.
So, for the listeners out there who are going through an injury, you've got to be your own advocate. If you're expecting for a doctor or a nurse practitioner or somebody to hold your hand and walk you through the process, that person doesn't exist. You have to take the reins.
And how was because you work full time and you also have a whole family that needs you to be there. How was this?
Well, it was difficult. It wasn't fair to them. The injury itself wasn't fair, right? It sucked. But as far as impact to the family, it was significant. And, life is a learning process. And I think that if I were ever to get injured again, the way I would handle it would have to be fundamentally different. When we were talking earlier, triathlon is a bit of a selfish sport. So is injury recovery. It is very taxing on everybody in your life, not just you. I have 5 kids. I have my amazing, wonderful wife, and it was punishing for her. She had to carry the load for a long time. Yeah.
Wow. Man, it sounds like you have a trooper of a wife that knows how to do a lot of things.
She's remarkable in every possible way. The strongest person I know.
Wow. So you said that you would approach an injury fundamentally different. What do you mean by that?
I think sitting around and waiting for somebody to refer me to the next best specialist to, try their wares, I would not allow that to happen again. You don't want to rely on Dr. Internet, of course, but you really need to work with somebody who has an acute understanding of sports-related injuries, or in this case, orthopedic and nervous system injuries, and, have them help guide you through the process. Otherwise, in my case, I spent months and months getting different kinds of cortisone injections and things like that were in no way beneficial. They did absolutely nothing for me. It wasn't like the pain relief wasn't there. They were addressing the wrong problem. So, in hindsight, I would absolutely insist on having the radiology stuff done up front. You've got to have a clear view. You can't expect your doctors to come up with a coherent treatment plan if they can't see what's going on. It's the blind leading the blind.
Right. I think a lot of folks, even myself, used to consider, why do I need to get an x-ray? Why do I need to get an MRI or a CAT scan or any of that stuff up front? But now, as I got older, it's like, to your point, it makes sense. You have to have a clear understanding of what the heck's going on. They can't see inside the body.
Absolutely. There's 2 schools of thought or 2 ways of thinking about this stuff. It's, root cause analysis, or, no pun intended on the root cause, or, they're going to treat symptoms until something bubbles up to the top and, well, finally we connect these 12 dots together, and that means that you've got this. You can't mess around. And also when it comes to nervous systems injuries, time is the enemy. You have to get that treated as quickly as possible, as aggressively as possible, because it was a year ago that I could finally feel all the toes on my right foot, right? That's 3 years of recovery for just that part. Had I waited any longer, had there been, further nerve damage, there's no telling what the damage could have been.
Wow. So going to transition just a little bit here, how was your training going into this race?
Fractured, to be perfectly honest. I did over the, let's say, October of 2017 to, say, May of 2018, spent a lot of time with my trainer in Kansas City, a gentleman by the name of Jamie Music, on strength training. And that was very helpful on a lot of levels. But the biggest of which, there's a relationship between back pain and core strength that not a lot of people really understand. He got that. And we spent a lot of time working on, core stability, core strength training, of course, the kinetic chain, your feet all the way up to your rear end, that kind of strength training, of course. But what became obvious pretty quickly is that the stronger your front is, the less work your back has to do. And if you can get that ironed out, so to speak, your back issues are going to improve dramatically. It's going to improve the ability that you run. It's going to improve your ability to, sit in an arrow tuck position for hours on end. It makes everything better. I don't think your core can be strong enough. I don't care who you are. It can always be better.
Wow. So going into this race, what kind of training plan did you use? I know you used the one out of Triathlete Magazine.
Yes, that's right. The simple 70.3 plan. It's a rudimentary plan. It's obviously, designed around a lot of different assumptions. But for me, I'm a busy guy. I have 5 kids. I have a wife that means the world to me. I've got, a lot of things that I have to do to keep, things going on a day-to-day basis. So for me, it was structure. I knew on Sunday that, my workouts on the following Friday and Saturday were going to be really tough. I knew that, on Wednesday it was going to be a pretty simple long run. I knew that Monday and Tuesday were more or less recovery periods for the preceding weekend. But it was especially important because we elected to move from Kansas City down here to Austin, God's country, in the early parts of this year. I do not recommend trying to do both, especially for busy households. Do not try to move and train for an A race like this at the same time. Something will give. But, we got down here and, I spent the summer acclimating to the Texas heat. So, that was beneficial. And, the plan itself, you got to run for 6 miles on this day at this speed, at this tempo. You got to ride your bike for 45 miles and then 10 miles at race speed. It's very basic. It's not a substitute for a trained coach, but it's a place to start. If in hindsight, if I had the time, I would prefer to have worked with a, professional coach, somebody like yourself, to understand how to shape my body for this race. A great example is I was very undertrained for the swim. I'm a good swimmer anyway. It was a mixed blessing that our swim ended up getting canceled. But had it taken place, and especially if we were trying to fight the currents that were in the Brazos River that day, it would have been a much different race. That's for sure. So there's a level of accountability that you get with a living, breathing coach, and there's a level of professionalism and customization you get with an actual coach that you don't get with a cookbook approach.
Right. So going into this race, what was your longest swim, bike, and run workouts?
Longest swim was 2,000 meters, and that was by design. I knew I wasn't going to have to do more than 2,000 meters. I could take a year off and go swim 1.5 miles if I wanted to. It may not be, the fastest time per 100 meters or anything like that, but I knew that I could do it. As far as the longest ride goes, right around 50 miles, I was less concerned with absolute distance and more concerned with the bike to run transition and, being able to come off the bike after a lot of miles and then, go run 2 or 3, the traditional brick style. So as a standalone, longest ride would have been about 50 miles. The longest run would have been neighborhood of 8, something like that.
Okay. So with this right here, did you do a lot of bricks in training as well, like 1 or 2 a week to get that feel of running off the bike?
Yeah, so this program, the one thing that I do think it does well is it acknowledges that for most people, you can't carve 5 hours out of your weekday evenings or mornings or whatever to go do what we do. So it tries to bias those long training sessions to the weekend, which is fantastic. Did I do a lot of bricks? Yeah. Yeah, I did. It was usually on a Saturday or a Sunday where you'd have a long, 40-mile bike ride into a, say, 4 or 5 mile run. And that was adequate. I mean, I was able to teach myself that even if you can't really feel your legs running, you just got to keep going. You get that first mile done, and, you're pretty much solidly into run mode at that point. And the rest of your muscle memory can take over. But that is still, I think for anybody who's not at the professional level, that transition is a very mental kind of thing. It's a very difficult thing to do well. There are things you can do pretty well, but I think that's the one thing that I took out of the training is how to manage that transition effectively, which is basically you just do it. Even if it doesn't feel right, even if you're going at 14 mile or 14 minute per mile pace, you've got to get that run started so that you can fully transition into the proper run style.
Right. So with your training going into this race, what workouts did you do that gave you the confidence going in there saying, okay, I have this, I know I'm able to complete it now?
That's a great question. Where I live is kind of on the edge of hill country, and I knew that the bike course for Waco was relatively flat. So when my bike workouts were 40 and 45 miles through, 2,000 climbing feet in elevation change, something like that, and I could get off and actually do, for me, a respectable run, I started to have the confidence to know that I could actually do it. But I don't know that there was ever a point where I said, I've got this, it's completely under control. Race day, I didn't know if I could actually ride the bike 56 miles and then run 13.1 after that. I wanted to, and I made myself do it, but there was never a point where I knew I could do it. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, being able to say, hey, I've done it on a run course that had a double circuit of Murder Mountain. The confidence level is very different.
Right. So if you could go back in time and use maybe a different plan or anything like that, what workouts would you want to do in training to give you the most confidence on race day?
That's a great question. I think more longer runs would be key. Being able to work at that, say, 10 to 11 mile distance. But I think that to do that, there are smarter ways to train for the run than just going out and running. I think strength training has to be a component of what you do, and it's not just going to be, your quads and your glutes and your core muscles. I think the thing that I overlooked and with the benefit of hindsight would do differently is strengthening my feet and ankles in particular. By the end of the race, the amount of pain I was in with my ankles on the very punishing run course, I can't even describe. It was awful. And they hurt for several days after. And I attribute that to just not having the strength in my feet and ankles required to perform at that level and at that distance.
So I know some people are going to say that, well, you probably didn't have the right shoes. Did you have the right shoes?
I absolutely had the right shoes. I spent a couple of years running in Hoka's, big marshmallow-style
Clown shoes, yep.
Clown shoes, yeah. And they make a wonderful shoe, but it's not for every foot. I think that the amount of cushion that those shoes provide takes away from foot strengthening and ankle strengthening. So what I did this year that's fundamentally different than any other year before is I switched over to Ultras. I had a pair of trail running shoes, which I did a fair amount of trail running, to try and keep things interesting. And on race day and for most of my long runs, I was running in Escalantes from Ultra. And the benefit of that I have found is that, with people who have duck feet like myself, having that enormous toe box to give your feet the room to spread out and create the propulsive surface and improve your proprioception, your awareness in space is critically important. So if somebody were to say to me, I have wide feet, should I be running in, 2Es or 4Es? I would say, no. I think that you need to find a shoe that doesn't just widen the overall body of the shoe, but widens the correct part of the shoe. You can't have the flex in the ankle side that you have in the toe side, for example. And I think that's one thing that Ultra gets very right, at least for people with my body type. Now, obviously, you're very active in social networking. I am too. We get these questions all the time. Should I run in Hoka? Should I run in Brooks? Should I run in Adidas? Man, don't ask that question. You have to find the right shoe for your foot. And it may not be the shoe that they have at the store. You may have to get creative. I never found a pair of Ultras anywhere but REI. But all the running stores too didn't even have those available.
See, and I think that's a very broad question that a lot of newer athletes ask. And I think the right question in that situation would be, how do I go about finding the right pair of shoes for me? That's the right question to ask for people that don't know. Hey, what you really want to know is, how do you find the right shoe, not if this pair of shoes is better or not. You're looking for, hey, there's all these different models out here of different models of shoes, but how do I find the right one for me? That's the real question you're really wanting to answer.
I absolutely agree with that. There's a natural bias when you're at the shoe store, the running store, whatever store you want to go to find your shoes. There's a natural bias to have something that's on the shelf, right? But that's not enough. And I think for a lot of people, especially the people that have been doing this for a lot of years, it's been a lot of trial and error, which can be an expensive proposition. But having the right shoe for your foot is an intensely personal journey that you have to get correct. Right. That's probably these people that are worried about the weight of an axle, or I'm not carrying too many fluids on the bike. Dude, just make sure your shoes fit, right? Let's start with the basics. Let's not become a weight weenie over, trivial stuff that's not really going to benefit you, compared to having the appropriate support that you need to do the most fundamental aspects of this sport.
I agree. So as far as nutrition goes, on your long training days where you're out there on the bike for 3+ hours, and then you're on the run for an hour and a half, 2 hours, what nutrition were you using, and how did you find this?
So on the course, or just general nutrition?
A little bit of both.
Okay. So we'll start with the training side. I had been a vegetarian for 20 years, and that suited me. It worked well. I think it was a good style, but I was getting a little worried in the early parts of the summer about just the way I felt on a run. So I reached out to my sister-in-law, who's a nutritionist, and she had me, do the food journal and give her all the data exports from the different applications. And she looked at this stuff and she said, well, I mean, if you're going to be a vegetarian and doing this sport, you have to rethink your protein intake. This is not something that you can address just with carbs versus fats versus, your macros like that. You have to have a level of protein that allows your body to not only perform, but also repair itself after. And her recommendation to me was to essentially to double my protein intake. And for me, as part of the head of a household that's very, very busy, 5 kids, trying to do meal planning that well with that level of vegetarian or vegan protein was a non-starter. It was too much processed food. So I made the decision to reintroduce meat into my diet, and I'm glad I did, because I think it's the only way I got across the finish line. And I owe all the credit to that to my sister-in-law, Cindy Lewis, who was able to work with me through this transition. Okay,
so what was your protein intake before, and what did she recommend, and what did you actually get to? Because you're at 190 pounds, 5'9", just for perspective.
Right. So I was training with about 90 to 95 grams of protein, and that was coming in through, the different vegetarian friendly protein options, your beans, your different legumes, some soy here and there. But a lot of that was coming in through processed proteins, things like veggie burgers, for example. And I think those are great for certain requirements. But I think for me, it was directly contributing to inflammation, body-wide inflammation. And it was creating a situation where my body couldn't repair itself from day to day. And my training was suffering. So when I made the transition, I introduced some very simple animal-based proteins, specifically chicken, white and dark meat chicken. And my protein on a busy training day, because it does need to vary if it's a rest day versus a training day, would get up into the 150 to 190 grams of protein. And it was an instant difference maker for me. I was no longer getting nauseous when I was running. I had much shorter recovery cycles. Basically, everything improved.
Wow. And for your training nutrition, what was this like for you, finding the right amount of calories that you wanted to consume during the workouts?
Good question. So I've always been a big fan of Tailwind. The part of the Tailwind brew that I thought was, at least for me, was lacking was on some of the basic amino acids. So I was actually supplementing the Tailwind with arginine, one of the fundamental amino acids, which for me, I noticed an immediate difference when I introduced arginine in terms of just the amount of energy reserves I could tap into. I wouldn't be dog tired after a 4-mile run. It would be an 8-mile run instead, for example. So that was working really quite well for me. Salt is always kind of a tricky thing. I was using some base salts as part of my brew, little witch's brew here. And that was always effective, but you can go too far. Sometimes you don't go far enough. So you just kind of have to work with it and listen to what your body's telling you based on the conditions for the day. And then just on a whim, I actually started adding some diluted Red Bull to this brew. And I'm sure it's a combination of the caffeine, the sugar content, maybe even the aminos that are in there. And for me, that was the right combination of things. I have an entire cabinet full of, the different race nutrition powders and brews and things like that. But this is the one that worked for me after a lot of trial and error.
Okay. So as we just transition a little bit to actually talk about your life here a little bit, when you're not training or racing or traveling, what are you doing?
I got to think back a bit here. I work for IBM, and IBM in general, most of the people on the side of the company that I represent work remotely. We work from home. So that's great if you want to try to incorporate training during your day, if you want to take an hour and a half long lunch instead of an hour. You can really manage not only your nutrition but your time as well. So that ended up being an accidental blessing, but I'm very grateful for it. The downside of it is a lot of time in a chair, and to this day I'm still working with a chiropractor to kind of keep me loose and help me with the stretches and the back cracking and all that kind of stuff that's necessary to manage these two disparate sides of my personal life.
Okay. So you're sitting in a chair. You also have a family of 5 kids and a wife. How are you able to balance life, work, and training all together with a big family like this?
I think that is not a written story yet. It's a journey. I think that triathlon can be a very selfish sport because almost by definition, you're doing these things alone. And for family-oriented people or, people with obligations at home of whatever kind, it's very difficult to find that balance. I know a lot of people will say, well, just get up at 5 a.m. and do it then. I don't do 5 a.m. I don't ever do 5 a.m. So for me, I really tried to compartmentalize it, at least during the week, to my lunch break period. I would carve out some time in my schedule and, at 11:30, get up, run. Or if I was on the trainer, we had a very, very wet fall here, so I spent a lot of time on the trainer. That is something that's a little bit easier to do without completely alienating your family. It's only mostly alienating. And, just go set up the trainer on the back porch, watch the rain, and go ride your bike for an hour and a half, 2 hours, or whatever it is. So there is no solution to that. It's a very tricky part of the game.
Right. So if we take a look at your training overall, what was the most hours you spent training in 1 week?
Between 6 and 2 weeks prior to the race, my weekend workouts started to get really, really long. More in the 3-hour time frame, things like that. And I realized for the hardcore Iron person types, that's not very long. For me, it is. But you go out, you ride the bike, you go 40 miles, and that takes you 2.5, 3 hours, whatever it is. And then you come back, you spend another half an hour trying to run. I would say in that 3 to 3.5 hour range was pretty much the max that I was doing during training.
Okay. So with training this long of a time on the weekends alone and then trying to train in the week as well, were there any days where you mentally didn't want to train? This episode is sponsored by Wasatch Apparel. Wasatch Apparel was founded on the belief that everyone should have the ability to have custom quality apparel without the stress of dealing with large clothing companies. The vision of Wasatch Apparel is to provide the highest quality apparel for endurance and fitness enthusiasts. They specialize in custom triathlon and cycling gear. Whether you're an individual that wants to make an impression or a large team that needs kits for everyone, Wasatch Apparel has the highest quality and customer service to deliver exactly what you need. Thank you, Wasatch Apparel, for sponsoring this episode. On the weekends alone and then trying to train in the week as well, were there any days where you mentally didn't want to train?
Yes. Yes, there were. There's a level of fatigue where overcoming it is less a physical activity and more a mental activity. And I think that is what distinguishes the people from, the did not start column to the, finished with a respectable time column. And for me, getting past that was a very important part of the process. It's kind of a weird journey that I think, really only people who do these very long endurance events understand that other people do not. When it's over, it's like, well, what do I do now? I mean, I used to spend 16, 18 hours a week training, and now I've got all this time back in my life. So, it's a weird trip, man. That's really all I can say. A little off topic here, but I think finding that balance is a very difficult thing to do. And maybe it's the voice of experience after you do this for several years where you start to kind of figure out a way to keep that balance together. But, for somebody who's just getting started or getting started again in the sport, finding that balance for their, real world things like, family and work and life in general versus the training side of what we do is a real challenge.
Right. Now, to transition a little bit, get closer to the race here, what was your taper like?
That is an interesting question. My taper was pretty short. If you define taper as, less activity than usual to allow your body to repair, it was a week long. But, I ran the day before we left for Waco, and I ran a little bit the day of our travel to Waco. So Waco was on Sunday. I ran a little bit on Saturday. I ran a quick 3 or 4 miles, something like that, on Friday. that was probably a mistake. I probably should have spread it out, but taper really messes with your head. When you take something out of your life that is not just a physical outlet, but also a mental and emotional outlet, like these long exercise sessions, and you take it out of your life very quickly, it's a shock to the system. I think it really messes with your head. So for me, I was really driving myself batty looking at all these course reports and things like that. Are we going to swim? Aren't we going to swim? Holy crap, it's 60 degrees in the water, and I was planning on 68. My taper was a little bit painful, to be honest. I think I made myself nuts.
And that isn't even counting I'm trying to say it tactfully, and the water reports versus what Ironman was putting out versus what everybody in the group was saying. This was also at the pinnacle because everybody has so much time on their hands now. They're not training, and they're just worried about the weather. Everybody comes as a meteorologist the week of the race.
That's right. Yeah. You're absolutely right. And, there were a number of people who, just in the different social media forums, who were trying to help people stay calm and, convince them that whatever's going to happen is going to happen, and you cannot control it. All you can control is how you handle it personally. So, I got my wetsuit out of storage. It was still sitting in a box. I eventually put it on with enough, cooking spray and sheer will. And, I walked around the house for a little bit, and I thought, okay, worst comes to worst, I can do this. They're probably not going to make us swim upstream with 8-mile-an-hour currents, so that means it's going to be point to point, which is basically all you could roll over on your back and still do fine and, float the course. I wouldn't recommend that, but for somebody who really had not trained for the swim, and to see these conflicting reports or forecasts that there may not be a swim, it may or it may not be point to point, it will be cold, and it's probably going to be full of all kinds of nasty things in the water. I don't know. It probably would have been more constructive to just, go find a place, do some open water swimming in the wetsuit and let it be. Our weather was not very conducive, so quite frankly, I lucked out when the swim ended up getting canceled. I would have done fine, but it's a statement of preparation, emotional preparation that I really did not have yet. When we got to the Ironman Village on Saturday and heard the reports that the swim was definitively canceled, it was a weird mix of emotions. I was disappointed because it wasn't going to be a triathlon in the usual sense, but when you think about it, the swim is about 10% of your time in the event. So get over it. You're still doing 69.1 miles, and it's really freaking hard.
Right, especially the hills here.
Oh, yeah.
To kind of move along here, when did you actually want to start traveling to Waco to get in the hotel or Airbnb? What does this all look like for you?
Yeah, so for me, we live about 80 miles from the race site. So we left the house here maybe 11 a.m. on Saturday, drove up there, had an absurd amount of time to kill, probably too much. But, the race isn't just about the race. It's about the experience and, walking through the village and meeting people and hanging out with people that have similar interests and understand our particular breed of crazy. For me, I left at 11 a.m. on Saturday, to answer your question. I would not have wanted to leave before that because I had too much time to kill, which means time to make yourself nuts. So it worked out real well for us. We had 4 of our 5 kids traveling with us. Another one found a place to spend the night. So, they got to experience the village as well, understand what this is all about, maybe see me in a slightly different light now that it's not just daddy disappearing for hours on end, but it's actually part of a greater thing. It was pretty cool. It was definitely a cool experience. And I think that's what is different between an Ironman event and, a neighborhood triathlon. It is the experience of the entire event.
Right. To kind of touch on something that I haven't really talked about with anyone, I mean, I really just thought of it was, what do you feel that it is like to be vulnerable to failure in front of your kids?
Well, I think fear of any form can serve multiple purposes. It can keep you alive in certain cases. It can keep you aware in other cases. For me, the fear of not completing was disappointment, not just to the people around me, but also to myself. For my family, I think that, if I ended up in that DNF column and had to, take the golf cart of shame back to the village, they would have looked at it and said, so what? I mean, look at what you did accomplish in a limited amount of time. For me to not succeed, I think I would have been much harder on myself. But I never really felt like my family would be disappointed. On the other hand, what I really tried to channel was to show them that with discipline and the right mindset and the right preparation, that, a 43-year-old couch potato like myself can accomplish something that's pretty damn cool. That's a special thing. And the desire to show that is a more effective use of that anxiety than the fear of avoiding it.
Right. So as you're in Ironman Village, what was your reaction to this, being here for the first time as an athlete?
Somewhere between terror and intense excitement.
That's a pretty wide scope in my mind.
It is. It absolutely is. I think for a first timer who really isn't necessarily sure that they can do this, the terror is a normal reaction. It's a very predictable reaction to this kind of an endeavor. And really, even wheeling up to the bike start line, because of the unusual start that we had in this event, I kept saying to myself, this is really happening. This is really happening. And I remember vividly starting up and I was like, okay, let's go do this. But as far as the village and getting started on the Saturday, Ironman runs one hell of an event. And the people of Waco are amazing people. We had the most amazing volunteers. We had a welcoming environment. It was like a big party, and everybody went away happy. On that Saturday, you would get checked in, and the volunteers are there, and they're explaining, we need you to sign this release. And, after we sign this release, we're going to go over here and do this. We're going to get you bags. We're going to get your swim caps for some reason. And I guess they were already printed, but, you're going to get your swag bag, go, walk through the merch tent, see what's going on there. Go look at all of the different vendors that are there, see what's, cool with wetsuits that give you abs and all kinds of stuff like that. It was like a big party and a convention mixed together.
Wow. So as you're there the day before the race, only at the village, you have to get your stickers and get your bag and then put the stickers on the bike and all this fun stuff and then check your bike in. How was your anxiety and nervousness while you're checking your bike in?
Well, that really was commit mode, because it would have been very easy to just disappear, right? But that never entered into my mind. My biggest concern and my biggest anxiety was just making sure that the bike was going to be 100% ready the next day, that I wasn't going to have to do any, early morning fill-ups. Oh my gosh, can I borrow your bike pump? I did systems checks and, check the brakes, check the cabling, all that kind of stuff, just getting everything ready for the next day and absorbing the experience of being around 4,300 other triathletes, some of whom, like me, were there for the first time. So the experience of the bike check-in, once you get past the confusion of it, because it is a very busy environment, I think it's just really more of that party aspect, but it's like the part of the party where you're like, okay, now who has to drive home now? Because the fun part's kind of over with. Now it's time for business.
Right. So the day before the race, after you check your bike in, are you going to get a certain meal in before the race? What does this look like?
Good question. So I had started to two things. I started carb loading a day and a half before the race. So really on Friday, pretty aggressively trying to take in simple and complex carbohydrates. But the other part is that I completely cut out anything with measurable fiber in it. No bulk fibers of any kind, no veggies. Fruits were kind of okay, but really trying to manage that for some very obvious and relevant reasons. Making sure that was not going to be in my system, complicating things on the day of the race. As far as a specific meal, I like I said, I had the carbs going, and I tried to stick to my training day heavy protein intake meals as well. So, lean chicken, lean fish, stuff like that. The dinner that we had the night before the race, my wife and I actually took the kids to the pool at the hotel and let them go crazy for a couple of hours, blow off some steam. And it was really more of a, screw it, let's order some pizzas. And we did. We ordered some pizzas. We just sat out and we had a good time. I really didn't want to get too carried away. And I don't drink or anything like that, so that wasn't a part of it. I just, I did a lot of prehydration of the water form and, had a last meal of Domino's pizza. And that worked.
So what time did you want to get in bed the night before the race?
Well, that is definitely a complication in a hotel room with 4 kids. The kids were pretty much, because of the swimming, the kids were pretty much wiped out by, 8:30. So, we put on TV, put the kids in their different beds. We had 2 rooms that were next to each other, put the kids in their beds, and I was probably in bed by 10, something like that. Now, I wouldn't necessarily recommend a 10 o'clock bedtime before an A race like this, but Waco was pretty unique because the swim had been canceled, which basically meant that the race itself was going to start, for me, an hour and a half later than usual. There were people rolling up at 8 a.m. to start the race. That's unthinkable for an Ironman sanctioned event. But this one, with the complications around the swim, it worked out fine. So, I got up the next day at 5:30. I had breakfast in the room. I was into transition at 6:30, and I had 2 hours to kill. And, I looked at my Garmin after a while, and holy shit, 9,000 steps already. That's a lot of pacing. So, yeah. It was definitely nerves at that point, but yeah, I was probably in bed at 10 o'clock the night before and up at 5:30 the next day.
Wow. So where did y'all stay at?
We stayed at a brand spanking new La Quinta, about a mile and a half from the start line. Really nice people. It literally had opened the Friday before the race. So, it was basically a soft opening by the time we got there. But it was a very nice place and, pretty well appointed. Obviously, I was not going to be able to do the breakfast the next day, but my wife and kids did. And yeah, it was a nice place, nice people.
Wow. So how much was it to stay there?
Well, we had a kind of a last-second change in our plans. I was going to stay at a Hilton property. I think it was called a Home 2 or something like that. And it became obvious that there were going to be more of us at the race than I had planned. I was only really expecting the 3 smallest kids to come with us. So Friday night, actually, switched from the Hilton property over to the La Quinta. So I didn't really have the benefit of advanced planning for the rooms. Ended up spending about $195 per room, with a AAA rate and all that kind of stuff. But it was worth it.
Wow. So the day of the race, you get up at 5:30, you get your breakfast, you get everything going basically, and then you head over to transition. What time do you get to transition?
I think it was around 6:30.
Okay. And once you're at transition, you're hanging out, just waiting to go here because you're not swimming. What was your mindset at this point?
Confusion, to be perfectly candid, because it was such an odd start. I mean, I've had rolling starts before, but not rolling starts with 4,300 other people. So the format of this race it was essentially based on bib number. And I mean, the pros started right at 750, if memory serves. And then you just iterate through the rest of the pack. So, for an hour and a half, you're kind of standing around, wondering how many more times you can go to the bathroom before you're, ready to start. And, we ended up waiting around for quite a while. But I think it was okay. It allows you to get really centered and emotionally and mentally prepared for what you're doing. That cuts both ways. Sometimes it can make you a little nuts, but it was fine. It was fine.
Wow. So as you're getting ready to actually head out on the bike ride here, you're just standing around waiting for hours, basically. Do you remember anything that anybody said beforehand about the race or anything like that? What you were talking about in transition?
What I remember is it was interesting to see the different tribes, the different teams of people kind of coming together and really being there to support each other and having a good time. Being a relative newcomer to the area, I didn't really have anybody there. My tri team, I think there were 4 of us there, but it was, pretty spread apart. So I really didn't talk to anybody. I just kind of minded my own business. I had, some headphones on and just kind of got myself into the, appropriate frame of mind.
Okay. So as you're starting your race, it's not really a can going off for the swim. It's more of a, hey, just get on the bike and head out. 6 seconds, there's the person in front of you. How was your first 2 miles of the bike ride for you?
It was fine. I remember trying very hard to have a structure and a plan and a strategy for how to do this. Because I knew that I could go out and get on the bike course and do 18, 19, 20 miles an hour. But if I did that, my run was going to suffer even more than it was going to suffer anyway. So the first couple of miles, it was more, getting yourself into the right positions for the long haul, and just experiencing the whole event, right? When we left the starting lines, we left in twos, right? So 2 people, wait 5 seconds, 2 more people, wait 5 seconds. You get the idea. Everybody ended up being spread apart pretty well, but not like it would be with more of the organic start with a swim. There was definitely some clustering. So as you're sort of finding your pack, your pace pack, there's a lot of dodging that went on. I mean, there were people flying past me, 25 miles an hour and, with the cool wheels that make the funny sounds and things like that. And, here I am on my very modest kit and, trying to stick to, 19, 18, 17 miles an hour, depending on where I was. And it's really more just finding your spot in the pack for the first couple of miles. And once you do that, it's like a rodeo. It's just how long can you do it,
Right. So whenever you actually get to miles 10, 20, and 30, how are you feeling? What's the road quality like? Are there any tight turns? What are the aid stations like? What's all this?
Okay, so road quality at the start was very different than road quality at the finish, because we start really in the heart of Waco proper, but within, say, the first 10 miles, you're out in the sticks. I mean, you're out in a very rural area, which, means you get off of that really smooth, polished asphalt and onto the chip coat type roads. So the road quality changed quite a bit between the start, the middle, and then again and the finish as you're coming back on these surfaced roads. which by definition affects the speed and the level of effort to maintain that speed as you're going through the course. But it was fun because it was different. It wasn't like you're looking at the same scenery. I mean, you're going past places where there's cows, and you ride past cows. Everybody has to moo. I don't care who you are. You're going to moo at the cows. You're riding past the horses. You say, "Hey, horse, how you doing?" Right? But I was surprised by a couple of things. I was surprised that they are. There's really two populations. There's the people who say, "Hey, pal, I'm passing you on the left here. Thanks. Have a nice day." All that kind of stuff. And then you got the people who are blowing past you and trying to pass on the inside of a curve. Stick to the first group because, the other group is going to happen anyway, and that's just their priority. But if you stick with these people that are, more or less polite and not trying to run people off the road, or at least not causing people to run off the road, you're going to have a much more enjoyable race. As far as the aid station goes, I can't say enough about the volunteers in Waco and how well supported this race was. I did take some water in a couple of places, but by and large, I really carried all of my own nutrition on the bike ride just because I had a very specific set of goals, and I was not trading with the same products that were going to be available. So I tried to stick with what I knew was going to work for me. Now, that said, use the porta potties, man. Just don't be too proud. I don't know how people pee on their bikes. That's not me. I don't think I'm going to ever want to do that. It's cool if some people think that's what you should be doing, but give yourself a break. And unless you're trying to win prize money at these events, which frankly none of us are, get off the bike. Stretch your back just a little bit. Go to the bathroom quickly. Get back on the bike. It's not going to cost you very much time, but the benefits are absolutely worth it. But back to the volunteers. There were dozens and dozens and dozens of volunteers just on the bike course. And these people, God bless them, they're sitting out there with oranges and bananas and Red Bull and flat Coke and Gatorade and water. And I don't know what the hell was going on, but there were clouds of bees at every station, at every stop. And I never heard a single volunteer complain about it. It's just the way it was. And, they do their best to keep the cups covered and all that stuff so you don't end up drinking a bee or something. But, what they had to put up with, especially as the day went on and the course got even hotter, is unbelievable. So to the people of Waco that supported this race, my hat's off. We could not have done it without the amazing people of Waco volunteering to do this race.
Wow. So as you're getting on the bike ride towards the later portions of 40 and 50 miles, how are you feeling? Do you have any cramps, GI issues, and mentally, are you doing okay?
Really, the only discomfort that I was experiencing was in my hands, of all things. And that's because I think I was gripping the bars much too hard. Just to compensate for, the chip coat roads. And in some places, they could be a little bit rough. But, when you got the death grip on those bars and, a very thin 2 millimeter thick layer of bar tape protecting your hands from the bar itself, it wears on you quickly. So that's probably the biggest source of discomfort that I experienced was just the hand cramping that was going on. Obviously, we all have to deal with some chafing issues and things like that, and no amount of a body glide or whatever your particular poison is going to cure that. But you don't really notice that until after the race. For me, it was the hands that hurt. I did make a very conscious effort, every 5 minutes or so to kind of stand up on the pedals a little bit, stretch out the back, and then get back into the aero tuck position so that I could keep going without, having a lot of back pain. And that's just my own cross to bear, right?
Right. So from a logistical standpoint, did you train enough for this course, being that you trained on hills versus flat riding? What was this like?
I think that I was very well prepared for the bike. I did a lot of preliminary work after the race guide came out to understand exactly what the elevation changes were going to look like, understand what the roads were like. Yeah, there were some last second changes to the course because of all the flooding and the rain that had been going on, but relatively minor impact in the grand scheme of things. So for the bike, I actually felt very well prepared. I will say there's a big difference between 40 miles and 56 miles. 40 miles, that's, about 2.5 hours for the average rider. 56 miles, that's 3.5 hours. There's a huge difference. If I were to do it again, I probably would train up to about 60 miles in the long sessions just to be prepared.
Okay. So, talk about the last few miles of the bike ride here, getting into transition. Are you doing anything different to raise or lower your cadence, or are you looking at anything like this to start preparing to start running?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I actually deliberately, primarily through managing gears, I was not going as fast as I knew I could. And I saw a lot of people similarly start to back off on the bike in the, say last 10 miles of the race. I'm glad I did. I think it made the transition to the run easier. I mean, there was less of that dead leg feeling, and that worked for me. But I mean, this course is very, very level, at least for, the long stretches at the beginning and the end. Yeah, there's some hills in there, but for the most part, our finish back into Waco proper and into transition was pretty darn level.
Right. So whenever you got to transition, what was this experience like for you? You were here for just a little over 10 minutes here. What were you doing, and how were you preparing to start running a half marathon?
Well, I deliberately spent an absurd amount of time in transition because I wanted to be sure my back was ready for this, just given the injuries that I'd been dealing with for years. I knew that giving myself some time for the transition and, making sure that my shoes were on correctly and, my mind was where it needed to be to go do this run course. I'm glad I spent the time to do that. I could have gone through transition much faster. I mean, I think however long I was in transition, it's a little weird because there was kind of a significant run out before you cross the start line. It's not really 10 minutes in transition. There's like a 3-minute run in there as well, but never mind that. For me, I wanted to take my time and be appropriately centered so that I was going to get through the run one way or the other.
You want to be basically in the right mindset before you get to the half marathon, because mentally this is the furthest you've run ever, and you want to make sure you're ready for it, right?
That's absolutely true. Not only was it the furthest I'd ever run, I mean, I've done half marathons standalone before, but certainly not in a triathlon format. And it's completely, the 70.3 distance or thereabouts, 70.3-ish, is very different from an Olympic distance. I had never done a run of this magnitude, certainly not on this kind of a course after a ride of that length. So to your point, I wanted to leave no stone unturned in terms of how prepared I was going to be to make this transition.
Right. So as you get out of transition and you make your first mile, what was the first mile like for you?
It was all mental. I don't even remember the physical experience of it. It was just getting that mindset of in place where you're getting the run started so that you can actually start running properly, right? For more seasoned athletes, I'm sure they don't have to go through this. For me, the first half a mile is really just it's really more like transition extended.
So are you walking at that point, or are you running?
No, I actually forced myself into a run I have a pretty strict cadence just because I'm not a very strong runner. I would do a half mile run and then, a brief walking period. So for me, I forced myself to get through that half mile so that I could say, look, a half a mile is done. You're in the run now. Now let's start it.
So what cadence do you look for on the run?
As far as my step cadence, that's a really good question. So with my back injuries, the higher my cadence, the better I do. So I was really trying to stay in the 170 to 175 range, which for me is pretty workable. Realistically, I did not maintain that, especially once we got onto Murder Mountain. But by and large, I try to stick to that half mile brief walk format with a pretty regular cadence.
Okay. So as you start thinking of the quality of the road, trails, or whatever it might be here for the course, what was your expectation versus what it really was for the course on the run?
A lot has been said about this topic. So there were some last-second changes to the run that made it substantially hillier than I think most of us were prepared for, especially, the recreational athletes like myself. I had looked at the elevation profiles and it, 700 climbing feet. Okay. What it was not 700 climbing feet was like over a half a mile. And, you essentially need a mountain goat to do it. So that was a bit of a surprise. And then to get to the top of the first hill, and then you start a series of other hills, it was just like, it was brutal. It really started to mess with my head because, my goal as a relatively weak runner is, to run on the stable ground and on the modest hills. But when it becomes a very steep hill, go ahead and walk it because, again, I'm not competing for prize money. I just wanted to cross the finish line. So for me, having all of those hills up front mess with my head because I look down and I'm at 3.1 miles. Oh, hey, look, I'm a quarter of the way done. Holy shit. It's been 45 minutes. The amount of walking on those hills that I saw, not just for myself, but with all of the recreational athletes was amazing to me. There was a lot of it. Very, very few people really tried to run those hills. And knowing that we were going to have to come back that way at, mile 8 through mile, 10 and a half, maybe mile 11, just made it even worse because it was like, if I redline now, there's no way I'm going to complete a second line, right. A second lap rather.
So with this redlining and kind of monitoring yourself, are you looking at heart rate? Are you looking at pace? What is this? Are you going off of RPE? What are you doing? I mentioned I work for IBM, and what I do with IBM is I help companies understand data. So naturally that carries over into my recreational athletic pursuits. And I really kept a pretty close tab on, mile to mile pace and elevation changes and heart rate and all that kind of stuff. What I was able to do by, setting these relatively modest goals for just keep moving on the run is I kept my heart rate exactly where I wanted it to be in, right around zone 2, zone 3, which I knew was going to be critical to completing the 13.1 miles on such a challenging course. So I knew that if I started to get into zone 2 and zone 1, especially zone 1, that my body was going to start to break down and there would be a good chance I probably wouldn't finish the race. So for me, I was really trying to be very conservative. Gotcha. So this is pretty much a lollipop, right? You go out, you do 2 loops, then you go to the finish, right?
Yep.
Okay. So whenever you're on the actual lollipop, I guess, not the stick, what was the best part of the run on that portion of the course? Because I know the best part of the run for everybody is obviously the finish, but we're not there yet. So what was your best part over there on the lollipop?
The best part of the run was coming out of transition, leading into Cameron Park, which is where the hills really started. And then on the second lap, that same stretch. The back half, or it's not really the back half, but the back 2 miles when you're on, I don't remember the name of the road. I apologize to the citizens of Waco, but when you're running on the other side of the river, towards the far side of the bridge, it was pretty hot in the day at that point, and there's absolutely no shade on that side of the run. So if you know that, you can prepare appropriately. I didn't know that, and I did not prepare appropriately. So that was not my favorite part, to be perfectly honest.
Okay. So as you're actually getting towards miles 10, 11, and 12, you're getting closer to the finish, but you're not quite there yet. How are you holding up mentally? Are you struggling to push? Are you struggling in a bad spot mentally? What is this like?
Okay, so about a year ago, a very good friend of mine that I've known most of my life told me that he had some pretty significant health issues. And it was actually, he was understating the nature of these health issues. He actually had a pretty rare cancer that was pretty reluctant to being treated. So, he told me this, and I elected to join a triathlon team that is actually dedicated to raising funds for early detection awareness and also helping the children and families of cancer patients who have a terminal or at least a severe diagnosis. And, it's a little bit like Make-A-Wish combined with American Cancer Society's aspirations to drive people to be aware of what's going on in their body and, when you're in doubt, to get it checked out. Because early detection with cancer is the way you win. It doesn't really matter what cancer it is. If it's too late or if the disease is significantly progressed, then it can be a real problem. So I digress for a moment. So I joined the F Cancer Triathlon team on behalf of my former roommate, Bill Watson. And that is what got me through the race. We lost Bill about 2 months ago now, and he left behind a wife and 2 really wonderful children. And one of the last conversations we had was after some complications had arisen and the disease had actually spread pretty aggressively. He told me that he wasn't done fighting yet and that he believed that I wasn't done with triathlons yet, implying that, he thought that I could actually do this. And that really became my mantra through the run was, thinking about how this terrible disease of cancer, or family of diseases called cancer, rips these people apart and rips their families apart. And if people can go through that and survive, then I can go run for 3 hours or whatever it was and cross the finish line. I had written on my hand in the first part of, when we had those couple of hours before the bike start, for Bill on my left hand. And I kept looking at that and thinking, Bill was able to survive this disease process for years and years, going through unimaginable amounts of pain and discomfort and inconvenience and impact to his family. So basically, shut the F up and start running. And that's what got me through. Wanting to see my family at the finish line, all of that. I just kept thinking about, do whatever you have to do to cross the finish line. And I did.
Wow. So this has a deep meaning for you because one of your best friends passed because of cancer.
Bill was the catalyst for all of this. But, over the intervening months and through all the hours of training, thinking about just doing whatever I could do to help people fight and survive cancer, kept me going through the entire process. And I think, for me, that worked. That's probably not what's going to work for other people, but it worked for me. And I'm pretty happy about that. Not a lot of people know this stuff, so I'm glad it's just you and me talking, right? But in all seriousness, it's a small gesture on my part to be a part of something bigger to help me achieve some other goals in my life, which, for me was to complete this race. After my own injury scuttled my efforts a couple of years ago and having to fight back from that, it was a big deal. And I'll be perfectly honest with you. I was not at all prepared for the emotion of finishing. That hit me, as the song goes, like a wrecking ball. I had no idea that was coming. I broke down on the other side of the finish line, being thankful to my friends and family who've fought through this disease, my immediate family who has supported me through the training process and spent hours and hours in the hot sun waiting for me to finish. When it was finally over with, it was a real surprise to me, the level of emotion that came out of nowhere. You've seen the hype videos on YouTube. I'm sure most of us have, right? The emotion is a real thing. And, for me, it ended up being a very physical thing. But I'm not really sure where I was going with this point. But, crossing that finish line, knowing that I had a purpose beyond just the selfish pursuit of hours and hours in the hot sun, made it that much more worthwhile and that much more relevant.
Right. So just to talk a little bit more about the finish line, as you approach the bridge the second time here, you're able to actually know that you're going to the finish line, and the entire finish shoot is basically the bridge here in Waco.
Yeah.
What was this experience like for you going into the finish shoot where you can see the finish line in the distance and then finally getting to the red carpet and getting to the finish line? What was this like?
Well, I was running on empty at that point. So, it really became a pure mental event or undertaking, I guess. Just keep the feet moving, look good for the cameras, and don't fall, which on that bridge was actually kind of an achievement because it is a little bit of a unusual texture, we'll say. But the environment of this race, and I assume other races like it, with that many people cheering, even for a back of the packer like myself, it's not something that's very easy to put into words. It's something you need to experience because it's pretty special. I was running on empty, like I said, and I really had no more energy to give, and it wasn't, I'm tired. It was, I literally can't pick up my feet anymore. But somehow I did, and I don't really understand it through the flood of emotions associated with it. But it was a remarkable experience, unlike anything I've ever done before.
Wow. So as you're finishing, what was this like for you? I mean, this is your first time to complete this. Did you expect it to be so overwhelming?
No, I did not. Most of the triathlons I've done in the past, you cross the finish line, they give you your free banana, your bottle of water, and you're on your way. There's a real after party sort of vibe in the village. I mean, you watch the awards being given out. Everybody's taking pictures, lots of hugs, high fives. The people you got to know on the run course. You're sharing some battle scars with them, and oh man, I can't believe how hard that was, and stuff like that. It's kind of hackneyed at this point because I've said it so many times. It's something you have to experience because of the emotional interplay of the positivity of the environment coupled with the level of exertion that was required, the fatigue, the fact that it's over with. All of those things mesh together. And, for people with the emotional range of a teaspoon, like your typical average guy, it's a lot to absorb. But I can't wait to do it again.
I mean, so just to elaborate on what you just said, most guys with the emotional range of a teaspoon, most guys don't really like showing emotion in general.
Yep.
And to work for something so uniquely different that's difficult, and then know all the time, dedication, and sacrifice goes into finishing just this one event on this one day that they picked so far away is really emotionally overwhelming. And it's different. And most people don't know how to express that. And it's normal.
I'm glad to hear that. There were not a lot of people who were not affected in an emotional way and on the emotional level at the end of that race. Maybe for the people who do 2 or 3 of these a year, different story. For people like me, where this is your A race, and not only is it the A race for the year, but your life to date, it's kind of surprising, and nobody can prepare you for it other than actually doing it.
So looking back on it, knowing that this was your biggest race that you've ever done, and everything really was overwhelming for you, how well prepared for this race do you feel like you were?
That's a really good question. I guess it depends on how I interpret my goals for the race. My primary goal was to finish, which I did. I lament the fact that the swim ended up being canceled, just because it seems like, well, it's not quite a 70-mile race, but man, it was pretty hard anyway. But on the other hand, with the gift of a week of hindsight now, I can look back and say, gosh, there's some things I wish I would have done differently, some things I wish I would have done better. And I think that this process of continual refinement is something that really distinguishes people who do this as a passion versus the people who do this because it could be done. And for me, this has always been a passion of mine, since I got into the sport, however many years ago. It is a driving force. It's one you have to understand so that it doesn't take over your life. But, looking back on this race and the level of preparation, I'm very happy with the level of preparation that I put in for the bike. For the run, now that I really understand that run course and understanding that, yeah, there were some last second changes, but the fact is, if you're going to have a hill or a race course with those kind of hills on it, you really need to be prepared for steep hill climbs in your training process. And I had been training on more gradual inclines, a mile-long hill that is maybe 200 or 300 feet of climbing distance or climbing elevation. This one, because there was such a fast climb to get to the top of Murder Mountain, and then a couple of more big climbs while you're up there. I would train differently for that. I've heard people talking about going into parking decks and things like that and training in those, which sounds a little dangerous personally, but it's a pretty good idea. I think that I would probably try to prepare for the run differently and do a lot more hill sprint training, because I think that would have made a big difference in not just my overall time, but how I perceive the race and how much I would enjoy the race. I'll be honest, the run was not enjoyable. It was really damn hard. And I don't mean to sound like I'm whining here. I think that because I was not adequately prepared, I did not enjoy it as much as I could have. Maybe that's the best way to spin it.
Okay. So what's something that you learned about this experience that you want to pass on to someone who hasn't done this race before?
Structured training is a must-do. And getting your nutrition and your hydration dialed in correctly is absolutely critical. I knew the hydration and the nutrition part. I just didn't know how to do it. So I'm very grateful to my sister-in-law for her help and just, the voice of experience, trying so many things that didn't work to be prepared for a race of this magnitude. My suggestion to anybody is to work on those things. As far as the specifics of the training, I think it's very helpful to be prepared for the course you're going to race on. But you also have to roll with the punches, because there will be changes to most race courses as you come up on the the eve of the event. And sure enough, there were a lot of those for the 2018 Waco race. For 2019, if it's in the cards for me to participate in it again, I think I have a better idea of how to prepare for it.
Okay. So we covered quite a bit about your race. Do you have anything else you want to add?
Just my profound gratitude to my entire support team that got me through it, especially to my wife, who's put up with a lot of training hours and, a lot of sweaty clothes in the bathroom and, just a lot of crap that it's very easy to take for granted. And, being able to do this kind of a race, to say I achieved this, that's not really an adequate statement, because it isn't just an I statement. It's a we statement, to my coach, Jamie, to, my wife who handled the vast majority of things as I was getting ready for this race, to my family around me that supported me, to my family that came out, just gratitude. I mean, we've used the word selfish a lot of time, and this is a selfish pursuit. So it's very important to give credit where credit is due, because the rest of life does go on even when you're out training. And the people that help you do this are as important to you achieving your goals as your individual contributions.
Wow. So what's next for you?
Well, I don't know, to be perfectly honest with you. I'd like to do some road races over the winter, because I think it's very important to not have that post-race blues take over. I think it happens to everybody. And even some of the greats like Marcus Cook and his son came out on Facebook and said, now what do I do? And I mean, the consensus opinion is you schedule something else, even if it's a turkey trot. Just get something on the calendar, because we are all so goal driven in this pursuit that you have to have a new set of goals once you complete, your A event for a given year. So for me, I'd like to do maybe some half marathons over the winter time frame, such as it is in Texas, because it is so temperate here. And then as far as triathlons next year, I don't know. I feel like I've got some unfinished business in Waco. I really want to do better on that course. I would like for the course to be complete. Obviously, it's out of our control to a certain extent, but I would really like to be able to say that I completed the total race that is the Waco experience. For where I am and where we are as a family, some of these destination races, it sounds cool, but that's not us, man. I'm not going to take my wife and 5 kids to Cabo for a race. That's just not going to happen. But maybe Waco or Lubbock, that could work. I've looked at Galveston. I hate humidity, but I do love an ocean swim. So maybe Galveston would be fun next year. I'm not really sure.
Okay. I've done Galveston, and I've done a relay in Buffalo Springs, and Buffalo Springs it's tough. It's not for the faint of heart, and I feel like Waco's pretty much up there as well.
Yeah, I've heard that about Buffalo Springs. The Redmond triathlons are pretty highly thought of. Also, not easy races. There was a series of races in Kansas City from a race company up there called Silverback. I had started to prepare for a 70.3 up there amidst all of my injuries. I'd love to get back there and do that one again. It's nice because I've got family up there and a place to stay, and it makes the traveling experience and just the logistical exercise that much more achievable. So, we'll see. We'll see. This is an expensive hobby, so you've got to look at all the dimensions, but I can't wait to get back out there again.
Wow. So as far as your bucket list races, what is on your bucket list?
Oh, boy. There are 3 that I would call bucket races. The San Francisco Alcatraz swims appeal to me because it's such an absurd endeavor to swim from Alcatraz to the shoreline. That's a massively difficult race. There's another long course open water swim down in Florida Keys where you physically swim around some of the islands. I think that sounds pretty cool. I don't know if it's bucket list, but the bucket list races, I mean, the ones that you really want to do, the ones that I really want to do before I shuffle loose the mortal coil here, there is a 7-day bike race around Iceland that I really want to do.
What's that called?
Oh, I knew you were going to ask that. Let me get back to you on that one. I can't remember the name. There are also some pretty extreme races in both Norway and Iceland that are like the Ragnar type formats. And these are badass triathlons, and in many cases it's cross-country type stuff. My wife and I were fortunate enough last year to be able to travel to both Norway and Iceland, and I really want to go back. And having races there is a great way to do that. They are terrifying races because of the level of effort, but I'd absolutely love to do those.
So do you know about the Fire and Ice?
Tell me more.
So I interviewed a guy named Tom Deakins about his race in Iceland called Fire and Ice, and it's a race over many days covering 250 kilometers where you pack all your own stuff and you stay in tents along the way, and there's river crossings you have to cross and continue moving forward, and the winds are very high. They're like 50, 60 mile an hour winds, and it's below 40 degrees Fahrenheit every day. And you're running in excess of 15, 20 miles every day. And you have to carry all your own food, your own sleeping bag, everything. It's very, very hard. The soil is not always packed, but the views are amazing.
That sounds pretty incredible.
I want to say that's episode 144. I could be wrong on that. I'm thinking it's that number.
Yeah, I'll have to look into that. Something like that, which really takes the triathlon format and then takes it to a whole other level, that appeals to me. That sounds kind of crazy, which makes it that much more interesting.
Yeah, that episode is actually 145, Fire and Ice with Tom.
You write that down. That sounds very cool.
Yeah. Now, it's a longer episode, but, I mean, it's definitely worth it. So, Scott, I only have really 2 more questions for you, and that's how can athletes follow you?
Well, I'm on Strava, which is probably the best way. The easiest way to keep track of me is to follow what's going on with the F Cancer Triathlon team. You're probably going to have to spell it out, though, if you're going to find us on the internet. That is a group that I intend to stay involved with because it is a cause I'm very passionate about. It's good people that just have been affected in different ways by this struggle. And I'm pretty active out there. Again, Strava works. Hit me up on Facebook if you like as well. There's probably not a lot of Scott Lewis's in Leander, Texas. So that's me.
Cool. So, Scott, I only have one more question. That's what's your definition of a perfect race?
Oh, boy. I think the perfect race is the race that you walk away from with a smile on your face. That's what it would be for me. I mean, I don't have the aspirations of, going to Kona as an age grouper or something like that. What I am doing, I do for myself and for my family's benefit, and to raise a couple of bucks for worthwhile causes. So if I can walk away from a race with a smile on my face, even if it's a pained smile, then it was the perfect race.
Wow. Well, Scott, thank you so much for spending some time with me today. I learned a lot about you, your experience, and I'm glad I was able to share your experience with everybody. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your time.
You're welcome. Have a good day, and we'll talk soon, okay?
Take care.
Thanks for tuning in today. I hope you were able to learn something from today's episode. If you enjoyed the show, please take a minute to leave a review on iTunes or share it with a friend. Be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. If you'd like to see pictures from this athlete's race, learn more about who I am, what I'm doing, or be on the show yourself to share your story, check out my website at CoachTerryWilson.com. Until next time, continue the pursuit.